In this video, we will explore the initial invasion of the Battle of Stalingrad. So please sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. His name was Alexei Voronov. He was 23 years old, and he had been born in a village called Miranovka, somewhere south of Voronezh, in a house with a crooked chimney that his father had always meant to fix. He had grown up watching wheat fields in the morning light. He had learned to read from a single book his mother kept on a shelf above the stove. He had fallen in love once with a girl named Doria who laughed too loudly and smelled of pine resin, and he had not seen her in 14 months. He thought about all of this while lying in the dirt behind a collapsed section of brick wall, listening to the sound of aircraft engines somewhere above the smoke. The sky over Stalingrad, on that morning in late August of 1942, was the color of a bruise. Not a fresh bruise, the sharp purple red of new pain, but an old one. The kind that has turned yellow and green at the edges and sits deep in the tissue where you cannot quite reach it. The smoke from the oil storage tanks on the bank of the Volga had been burning for 2 days, and it had spread across the city like a second sky, low and slow and absolute. The sun existed somewhere behind it. You knew this the way you knew things in a dream, as a certainty without evidence. Alexei pressed his back against the bricks and closed his eyes for a moment. He was not sleeping. He had not slept, and he tried to count 31 hours, perhaps 32. But there were moments in the spaces between the sounds where he could lower himself just slightly. Not into sleep, into something thinner, a resting of the mind's outermost layer, while everything underneath stayed awake and listening. He was good at this. He had gotten good at this. The city around him did not sound the way a city was supposed to sound. He had only been to a city twice before in his life, once to Voronezh as a boy, once to Saratov on a military transport, and both times he remembered the noise of it as something lead and alive. Trams, voices, the grind of metal and the bark of dogs, and the particular low hum that a large number of human beings make when they are all simply existing near one another. That deep, unconscious sound of people living was entirely absent now. What replaced it was harder to describe. There was distant percussion. There was always distant percussion. The artillery worked in patterns that he had begun to unconsciously catalogue, the way a farmer learns the rhythms of weather. This was incoming. That was outgoing. This particular ripple of sound meant something large, somewhere to the northwest. That lower, closer sound meant something smaller, more personal. His body had learned the grammar of it without his permission. He would feel the difference in his chest before his mind had even registered hearing. There was also silence, and the silence was, in some ways, worse than the percussion, because the silence was not empty. It had texture. It was the silence of a street that had held 10,000 people and now held none. It was the silence of apartment buildings with their fronts blown away, standing open to the morning like doll houses, their interiors exposed, a table still set, curtains moving in air that had no business moving through them, a child's coat hanging on a hook beside a door that no longer existed. The silence of all of that, waiting. Alexei opened his eyes. Across the rubble, perhaps 40 meters away, Private Semyon Grishko was watching him. Grishko was 19 and from Tambov and had, until very recently, been almost aggressively cheerful in a way that Alexei had found grating, and then, over the weeks, had come to depend on the way you depend on a particular sound your house makes at night. Grishko was not cheerful now. He was lying on his stomach with his rifle across his forearms and his chin in the dirt, and he was watching Alexei with an expression that Alexei recognized as the look of a person who is waiting for someone else to tell them what to do. Alexei did not always know what to do, but he had learned to look as though he did. He raised 2 fingers. Wait. Grishko lowered his chin a little further into the dirt and waited. The aircraft sound had passed. Or perhaps it was still there and had simply blended into the general weight of the air. It was difficult to say anymore where the sound ended and the feeling began. Everything here had a vibration to it. The broken buildings, the ground itself. When the large shells landed, you felt them in the soles of your feet and in your back teeth and somewhere behind your eyes, a pressure that wasn't quite pain but lived in the same neighborhood. Alexei thought of his mother's kitchen. He did not do this on purpose. His mind simply went there, the way water finds the lowest part of a floor. The kitchen in Miranovka, the particular yellow of the walls, which was not quite yellow and not quite white, but something specific to that room, and that light at that time of morning when the sun came through the east window and landed on the plaster. The sound of the cast iron pot on the stove. The way the fire inside it made a low rushing sound like a river. The smell of kasha, buckwheat and milk, and the faint sweetness of a birch log burning. He breathed in through his nose and got dust and char and something underneath both of those things that he had learned not to name. He breathed out. He was He was in Stalingrad. He was 23 years old and alive, which was something, and his rifle had 12 rounds in it, which was also something, and there was a wall between him and whatever was to the west, which was something too. You collected the somethings. You built them into a structure, and you stood inside it, and you did not think about the things that were not something. Grishko shifted. A small sound of boot leather on rubble. Alexei held up his hand again, flat. Still. The boy went still. Somewhere to the north, a building came down. Not explosively, not the sharp catastrophe of a direct hit, but slowly, in stages, the way a very old and very tired thing sits down. A long grinding, a settling, a final sigh of masonry. Then dust spread out along the street in both directions like something breathing, low and even, turning the air white for a moment before it thinned. Alexei watched it come toward him. The dust reached him and passed over him and continued on behind, and he was, for a moment, inside the dissolved city, everything soft and pale and undifferentiated. And then it passed, and the world came back, and he was still there, still alive. He thought, my father never fixed that chimney. He thought, I wonder if Doria is somewhere safe. He thought, 12 rounds. He pressed his back a little harder against the bricks. The bricks were warm. They had been warm for 2 days, and he had stopped trying to understand why. Whether it was the heat of August or the heat of fire somewhere below, the buildings here bending downward into their own foundations. He had simply accepted it, the way he was accepting so many things now without the energy for understanding them. The warmth was there. He was leaning against it. That was enough. From somewhere in the rubble behind him, Corporal Nadia Lazareva's voice came, low and even. They are moving on Pushkinskaya. I can hear the vehicles. Alexei turned. She was crouched in what had been a door frame. Her dark hair whitened with plaster dust, her expression exactly the same as it had been yesterday and the day before that, careful, present, unreadable. She had been a school teacher in Leninsk before the war. She had told him this once, matter-of-factly, the way she told him everything. She was 28 years old, and she was better at this than most of the men he knew, and none of them said so out loud. and all of them knew it. "How many?" he said. "Enough," she said. He nodded. Enough was the right answer. More than one, less than the point where counting them changed anything. He looked at the sky, the brown-black ceiling of it, pressing down. He thought about the Volga, which was somewhere to the east, just a kilometer perhaps, a kilometer and a half the wide brown river that was the reason any of them were here, the reason the city mattered, the reason this particular piece of rubble on this particular street on this particular morning in August was worth dying over. The river, the grain of Russia moving south, the oil of the Caucasus moving north. This city, this name on a map, holding the thread. He did not think about the politics of it. He had never been particularly good at the politics of it, and there was no one here to explain it to him in a way that made sense anyway. What he thought about was simpler. He thought about the fact that behind him was the river, and across the river was everything that was not this, and that the only job was to ensure that the river stayed behind him and not in front. That was all. That was the whole of it, reduced to something he could carry. He looked at Grishko, who was still watching him. He looked at Lazueva, who was already watching the western street. He picked up his rifle, settled the weight of it, felt the grit of it against his palms. "All right," he said quietly, and they moved. Pushkinskaya Street had once sold clocks. Alexei did not know this until Lazueva told him, sometime in the first hour of moving through it. She had been to Stalingrad once before the war. She said a summer visit, years ago, to see a cousin who no longer lived here or anywhere, and she remembered the street specifically because of a shop with a window full of them. Dozens of clocks, she said, all different sizes. And somehow, in some arrangement she could not now explain, the owner had kept them all synchronized, so that when you walked past on the hour, they all struck at once. Not in unison exactly, because the tones were all different, deep and shallow, bright and hollow, but in the same moment, a great lead ringing that spilled out onto the pavement and followed you half a block. She told him this while they moved in single file along the eastern wall of a gutted apartment building, stepping over things Alexei was careful not to look at. "Did you go inside?" he asked. "No," she said. "I just stood outside and listened." There were no clocks now. There were no windows. There was the building itself, or the idea of the building, the walls still standing in sections, the roof gone entirely, the interior open to the brown sky. And there was the smell, which was the smell of all the streets here. Ancient dust disturbed from depths it was never meant to see, and underneath it, older things. Stone and clay and the particular mineral darkness of basements opened by force. Grishko was behind Alexei. Alexei could hear his breathing, not ragged, not panicked, just present. The boy had a habit of breathing slightly through his mouth when he was concentrating, and Alexei had come to use the sound of it as a kind of reassurance, the same way you might use the ticking of a clock in a dark room. As long as he could hear it, the world was still in some kind of order. They moved slowly. This was the first lesson the city had taught them, and it had taught it quickly. In the open country, in the months before Stalingrad, speed had been safety. Speed meant you were a difficult target. Speed meant you covered ground, and ground was the measure of survival. But the city had reversed this logic entirely. In the city, speed killed you. Speed meant you turned a corner into something you hadn't seen. Speed meant noise. Speed meant you didn't notice the hole in the floor until you were in it, or the sniper's window until the sniper used it. In the city, you moved the way water moved in winter. Slowly, feeling for where the ground was solid, Lazaeva stopped. They stopped. She was looking at a section of wall to their left where a doorway had been. The frame was still there, twisted, the door itself long gone, and she held one hand behind her, flat, the signal for absolute stillness. Alexei listened. For a long moment there was nothing. Just the background texture of the cities suffering, the far percussion, the settling of distant rubble, the wind through the open buildings making a low sound like breathing. And then inside that, something else. Something his mind had to reach for before it could name it. Footsteps. Not they footsteps. Something heavier. The particular rhythm of military boots on loose stone, and the soft metallic sound that comes with equipment, the tiny sounds of slings and buckles and the things a soldier carries moving against each other. It was coming from the other side of the standing wall to the north, parallel to them and perhaps 20 meters away, and it was moving in the same direction they were moving. Lazaeva turned her head very slightly. Alexei could see the side of her face. She was counting. He counted too. He had learned to count footsteps, the way you might count heartbeats to estimate a pulse. The rhythm told you something. One man moved differently than three. Three moved differently than eight. Eight moved differently than a patrol, which had its own irregular music, the gaps where men checked their distances, the variations in stride length, the subtle syncopation of people trying to be quiet without having agreed beforehand on how to do it. He counted 4, perhaps 5. He looked at Lazaeva. She held up 4 fingers, then tilted her hands side to side. 4, maybe more. She had counted the same thing. 4 German soldiers, on the other side of a wall, moving north on Pushkinskaya Street. They waited. This was the other lesson the city had taught them. Not just to move slowly, but to wait. To let things pass. To understand that not every encounter had to become a fight, and that a fight chosen badly cost more than the ground it was fought over. Alexei had watched men in the first days here who had not learned this, men who had come from the front with the open country instinct, who heard the enemy and immediately moved toward the sound. He had watched what happened to them. He had filed it away in the part of himself where he kept the things that were too heavy to carry in the front of his mind but too important to put down entirely. The footsteps passed. They grew quieter, then quieter still. Then the background noise of the city reclaimed them, and they were gone. The mill district smelled of grain. This surprised Alexei every time he passed through it, which was not rational. Of course, it smelled of grain. It had been a grain processing district for longer than anyone living could remember, but there was something disorienting about it nonetheless. The smell was gentle. It was domestic. It was the smell of bread not yet made, of winter stores, of the particular dry sweetness of milled flour caught in the wood of old buildings, soaked into the walls over decades until it had become structural, part of what held the place together. It was the smell of an ordinary life, and it did not belong here, in this. And so each time Alexei's nose found it, he felt a brief and almost painful confusion, the way you feel when you hear a song from childhood in the wrong context. They moved through the late afternoon. The light, what there was of it, had shifted from the flat gray-brown of midday towards something slightly warmer, not golden. Nothing so kind as golden, but a deeper amber where it came through the smoke and caught the dust hanging in the air. It made the ruins look almost soft. It was, Alexei thought, a cruel thing for the light to do, to soften the edges of something like this, as though the day were trying to make it bearable by making it beautiful, and not quite managing either. Lazaeva was at the front now. She had taken the lead without discussion somewhere in the middle of Pushkinskaya, and no one had suggested otherwise. She moved with a quality Alexei struggled to name, not boldness exactly, not the military confidence he had seen in officers who had been trained for it. Something more economical than that. She moved like a person who has made their calculations in advance and is now simply executing them. And the calculations were good, and she knew they were good, and so there was no need for the performance of certainty because the certainty was actual. Behind her, Baranov had begun to return. It was gradual. The way eyes thaws not all at once, not dramatically, but in the progressive loss of rigidity. By the time they had crossed the open stretch of the mill district's eastern approach, he was walking with purpose. By the time they had reached the cover of the first standing wall of the large mill building itself, he was holding his rifle correctly, checking his angles, doing the small unconscious things a soldier does when the soldier part of him has come back online. He did not speak. None of them spoke. But once, when Alexei glanced back, Baranov caught his eye and gave a small nod, and Alexei returned it, and that was the whole of what needed to be said. Grishko, at the rear, was managing. This was the best Alexei could say, and he meant it without condescension. Managing was not a small thing. Managing was, in fact, the entire task, the task that men twice Grishko's age had failed catastrophically at, in the weeks since August had begun. Grishko was 19 and frightened, and he was managing, which meant he was still checking the corners, still keeping his spacing, still moving when he was supposed to move and stopping when he was supposed to stop. His breathing was still audible, that particular open-mouthed concentration, but the rhythm of it had not changed, and for Alexei the constancy of that rhythm was its own kind of reassurance. They entered the mill building through a gap where the eastern wall had partially collapsed, creating an opening large enough to move through without stooping, the broken bricks stepping down on either side like rough stays. Inside, the building was vast. Alexei had not been inside this specific mill before, and the scale of it surprised him. The ceiling, what remained of it, was perhaps 12 meters overhead, or had been. Half of it was gone, open to the sky, the structural beams exposed and in several cases dangling, their far ends unsupported, hanging at angles that looked temporary in the way that things look temporary just before they become permanent. The floor was concrete, cracked in long fault lines that ran the length of the building, and across it were the machines enormous, incomprehensible, the machinery of industrial milling, iron and steel and belts and rollers that had processed the wheat of the Volga basin and sent it north and south and west as flour. Some of the machines were intact. Some had been struck by something and were merely sculptures now, their function destroyed but their mass remaining, standing in the rubble of their purpose like monuments. Between and beneath them, cover. Alexei felt himself breathe more fully for the first time in hours. Cover was the grammar of this city. Cover was what turned rubble from catastrophe into resource. The same destruction that killed you also, if you read it correctly, sheltered you. Every collapsed wall was a potential position. Every pile of machinery was a shadow you could disappear into. You learned to look at ruins not as what they had been but as what they now were, as pure geography stripped of its social meaning. And in that stripped state, certain things became useful. He led them to the base of the largest machine, a roller assembly the size of a small house, still largely intact, positioned in the southwest corner where two standing walls met it and completed three sides of a shelter. The fourth side was open, facing east, facing the direction they had come from, which was wrong tactically. Ideally, you wanted to face the direction of threat, but the threat had been to the west, and so east-facing was, for the moment, acceptable. They settled. This was the word for it, settled, and it was accurate in a way that a more dramatic word would not have been. There was no sitting down with relief, no collapsing, none of the theatrical exhaustion Alexei had seen in soldiers in training films who had never actually been tired. What happened was smaller and more functional than that. Each of them found a position that balanced cover with sight line, put their back against something solid, let their weight redistribute, and became still. For a long time, no one spoke. Then Grishko said, very quietly, "Is there water?" There was a pause. "Yes," said Lazaryeva. She unclipped the canteen from her belt and passed it to him. He drank, carefully, not greedily, which meant he had been taught right or had learned it himself, and passed it back. She drank, passed it to Alexei. He drank, passed it to Baranov, who held it for a moment as though he had forgotten what it was, then remembered and drank deeply, and handed it back. "Thank you," Baranov said. "There's not much," Lazaryeva said. "Not unkindly, just factually." "No," said Baranov. "Thank you anyway." The shadows inside the mill were lengthening. The amber light was moving up the walls as the sun dropped behind the smoke and the ruins to the west. In another hour it would be dark, not the clean dark of the countryside, which Alexei still sometimes thought of with a longing so acute it felt like hunger, but the particular dark of the city under siege, which was never entirely dark because somewhere there was always something burning, and the burning threw an orange light against the underside of the smoke that made the sky glow like a coal. You could always see just enough to see the wrong things. Baranov spoke. "I was a school teacher," he said, then stopped, then said, "before." He said it the way people said before in this city, not as a specific time reference before what, before when, but as the name of an entire other world that had existed on the other side of an uncrossable border. Alexei looked at him. "What did you teach?" Lazaryeva asked. "Mathematics," Baranov said. He paused. "Also geography, in the last 2 years. We were short a teacher." "I taught literature," Lazaryeva said. "And language. Russian language and literature." A silence. The distant percussion continued its slow, irregular work. "What did you teach them?" Baranov asked. "The literature. What did you give them?" Lazaryeva was quiet for a moment. She was looking at the far wall of the mill, or past it, or somewhere behind it entirely. "Pushkin," she said. "Always Pushkin first, and then Tolstoy, and then Chekhov, for the older ones. I like Chekhov best." "Why?" Alexei asked. He hadn't planned to ask. The word came before he decided to say it. "Because he was honest," Lazaryeva said. "He didn't clean things up. He wrote about people who meant well and still made a mess of things. And he didn't punish them for it, and he didn't excuse them either. He just showed them, as they were." She paused. "I thought that was the most important thing you could show a child. That life was complicated, and that complication wasn't failure." No one responded to this immediately. The mill held its vast dark quiet around them. Then Grishko said, from his corner, with the slightly embarrassed casualness of someone who wants to participate but isn't sure they have the right, I didn't really read much. I like football. A beat. What position? Baranov asked. Center forward, Grishko said, with quiet pride. Any good? I was all right, Grishko said. Then, yes, actually, I was quite good. Something shifted in the air of the shelter. Not laughter, none of them laughed. None of them had the resources for laughter at that particular moment, but the thing that lives in the same neighborhood as laughter. The slight easing. The acknowledgement that the people in this corner of this ruined building were, in some way that still mattered, people. Alexei leaned his head back against the iron of the machine. He thought about what Lazaeva had said, about Chekhov, about complication not being failure. He thought about the choices he had made in the past weeks, the moments where he had turned left instead of right, had waited instead of moving, had moved instead of waiting, and the outcomes of those choices, and how impossible it was to know which choices had been good choices and which had been lucky ones wearing the clothes of good choices. He had gotten here. That was something. But getting here had required 100 small decisions, and he could not, if pressed, have defended more than a handful of them with anything like certainty. He had guessed, often. He had felt, more than reasoned. He had done the thing that seemed right in the particular second that it needed to be done in, and the seconds had accumulated into minutes, and the minutes into hours, and somehow the hours had not yet killed him. Was that wisdom? Was that luck? Was there, out here, a difference? He didn't know. He was very tired. We should rest in shifts, he said. 2 awake, 3 sleeping. I'll take first watch with. He looked at Lazaeva. She nodded. Wake Baranov and Grishko in 2 hours. Grishko was already struggling. Alexei could see the way the boy's head was making its slow involuntary descent toward his chest, the small corrections as he jerked back to attention, the increasingly long pauses between corrections. Grishko, Alexei said softly. The boy looked up. Sleep. The permission in the word was audible and immediate. Grishko lowered himself sideways onto the concrete, tucked his arm under his head, and was as far as Alexei could tell asleep within minutes. The particular rapid unconsciousness of the young and the profoundly exhausted. Baranov lasted perhaps 10 minutes longer before the same gravity took him. Lazaeva moved quietly to a position with a sight line toward the building's entrance. Alexei moved to the opposite angle. Between them they covered the approaches. Outside, through the gap in the wall, the sky was darkening from amber to copper to the deep glowing ember orange of a Stalingrad night. The Volga was somewhere close, perhaps 800 meters east. On still nights you could hear it, or imagine you could the vast flat movement of all that dark water, indifferent, continuous, carrying the reflection of the burning city on its surface like something it had been asked to hold and could not put down. Alexei listened for it now. He thought, for a moment, that he heard it, a low sound beneath everything else, patient and deep and entirely untroubled by the things happening on its western bank. It was probably the wind, but he let himself believe it was the river, because the river meant the river was still there, and the river being still there meant something, meant east was still east, meant behind him was still behind him, meant the world still had a direction and a grain. He breathed in. He breathed out. He watched the dark. The night had its own geography. Alexei had learned this in the first week, when the nights had still surprised him, when he had still carried the assumption, imported from somewhere earlier in his life, that darkness was a simplification of the world, that it reduced things, made them less. In the countryside, this had been largely true. Night in Miranovka meant the fields disappeared, the horizon disappeared, the complexity of the visible world contracted to the circle of a lamp's reach, and inside that circle things were fewer and simpler and rest was possible. Night in Stalingrad did not reduce. It transformed. The sounds changed first. The artillery did not stop, it never entirely stopped, but its character shifted. The big guns that worked in daylight had a different rhythm after dark. More deliberate, more patient, as though in the absence of visibility they had decided to be more thoughtful about it, each round a considered statement rather than part of a conversation. And between the rounds the silence was deeper, paradoxically, than daytime silence, because daytime silence was always filled with the small ambient sounds of living things going about the business of being alive, and nighttime silence had no such filling. It was structural. It had weight. Then there were the sounds that only the night produced. The fires, for one. Fire in daylight was something you saw. At night it became something you heard. There was a section of the tractor factory district to the north that had been burning continuously for 5 days, and at night, when the wind came off the steppe from the east, you could hear it clearly from the mill, a long, low, busy roaring, like a crowd heard from a great distance, the sound of many small fires that had joined into one large decision. And the river, at night, Alexei was more certain he could hear the Volga. Whether this was real or constructed, he had stopped trying to determine. The sound was there, low and continuous, under everything else, and it was the sound he oriented himself by. In the dark of the mill, lying on cold concrete between watches, he had found himself turning toward it slightly, the way a plant turns toward light, not deliberately, not consciously, just the body's own navigation. His watch passed without incident. This was not nothing. Incident-free watches were their own form of gift, and he received them as such, without taking them as indication that the next watch would also be incident-free. That was the second trap. After fear, the trap of pattern, a beginning to believe that because the last hour had been quiet, the next hour would follow suit. The city had taught him that quiet was not peace. Quiet was just quiet. It had no implications. At the 2-hour mark, he woke Baranov and Grishko, who came awake in their different ways. Baranov immediately and completely, sitting up in one movement, his eyes clear, a man who had always known how to surface from sleep like surfacing from water. Grishko more gradually, blinking, returning to himself in stages, assembling the present moment from its parts. Alexei and Lazieva lay down. He did not expect to sleep. He rarely expected to sleep and sometimes slept anyway, which was its own minor miracle, and sometimes did not sleep and simply lay in the strange suspended state that was not sleep but was at least horizontal, at least a lowering of the body's demands on itself. He had come to value this state almost as much as sleep. It was a negotiation with exhaustion rather than a resolution of it, but negotiations had their worth. He was asleep within minutes. He dreamed of the wheat fields outside Miranovka, which was where he always dreamed when he dreamed of anything good, the specific quality of light in late July, when the wheat was almost ready and the fields went gold in a way that was not metaphorical, that was the actual color gold. And in the early morning, with the dew still on everything and the light coming low from the east, it was almost too much to look at directly, like looking at something that had been made to be felt rather than seen. In the dream, he was walking through the fields. He was not a soldier in the dream. He was simply himself, walking, the wheat at shoulder height on either side, the path ahead curving slightly, and somewhere ahead not close, not far the sound of someone laughing. Doria, perhaps, or his mother, or neither. Just the sound, the specific music of a woman laughing without self-consciousness, fully given over to whatever had caused the laughter. And he was walking toward it, and the wheat was gold, and the sky was blue, and the path kept curving. He woke to Grishko's hand on his shoulder. "Someone outside," Grishko said, very quietly. Alexei was sitting up before he was fully conscious. He looked at Grishko's face. The boy's expression was focused, not panicked. Focused, and he was pointing toward the north side of the mill where a section of the wall had fallen outward, leaving a gap at ground level, not large enough to walk through upright, but large enough to see through if you were willing to get onto your stomach and put your face close to the rubble. Baranov was already there, on his stomach, motionless. Alexei moved to him, got down, looked. The glow from the northern fires was sufficient to see by, in the way that everything in Stalingrad at night was sufficient to see by, not well, not clearly, but enough. Through the gap he could see a section of the street that ran along the mill's northern wall. And on the street, moving slowly from west to east, was a figure. One figure, alone, walking. This was wrong in several ways simultaneously. One figure, alone, at this hour, moving through open street. It violated every operational logic Alexei had accumulated in the past weeks. Soldiers moved in groups, or didn't move at all. Patrols moved in groups. Scouts moved in pairs. One person alone and walking openly in the middle of a contested street at 2 in the morning was not a soldier. He looked more carefully. Small. The figure was small, not a child. He reassessed quickly. Not small in that way, but slight, and the movement was wrong for a soldier. It was the movement of someone who was cold and tired and going somewhere they had decided to go regardless of the obstacles between here and there. It was civilian movement. The movement of someone who had not been trained out of walking like a person. He watched the figure. It stopped. It stopped in the middle of the street and looked directly at the mill building. Not at the gap where Alexei was watching. It couldn't have seen him. He was certain of that, but at the building generally, as though considering it, as though doing a calculation. Then it turned and walked directly toward the entrance gap on the eastern side of the mill. Alexei was on his feet. He touched Baranov's shoulder and pointed toward the entrance. Baranov nodded and moved. Alexei went the other way, circling through the machine shadows to come at the entrance from a different angle, not because he expected a threat. The figure was too small and too alone for organized threat, but because you didn't stand in doorways and you didn't have only one angle on an unknown. He waited. The sound of careful footsteps on rubble. The figure entering the gap, ducking slightly, standing up inside the mill, pausing, looking into the dark interior. From the other side of a roller housing, Baranov said, quietly, in Russian, "Don't move." The figure did not move. "Who are you?" Baranov said. A pause. Then a voice, female, tired, slightly hoarse, said, "My name is Galina. I'm looking for the 62nd Army position on Artillery Iskaya. Someone told me you were using this building." A silence. "Who told you?" Alexei said, from his angle. The figure turned toward his voice. In the fire glow coming through the gaps in the roof, he could see a face. A woman, perhaps 35, perhaps older. It was difficult to say because the past weeks had a way of adding years to faces that had nothing to do with time. She was wearing civilian clothes, a dark coat, practical boots, and she was carrying a canvas bag over one shoulder, large and apparently heavy, because she had shifted it to her other shoulder as she entered, and it had made a sound of glass or ceramic moving against itself. "A soldier," she said, "on Pushkinskaya, this afternoon. He said there was a small group here. Russians." She looked at him directly. "You're Russians?" "Yes," Alexei said. "Then I'm in the right place." She shifted the bag again. "I have food. Some of it. Anyway, I've been distributing what I can. There are people still in the basements on the western side, civilians. I've been moving between them." She paused. "I could also use somewhere to sit down, if that's possible." Alexei looked at her for a moment. He looked at Lazaeva, who had appeared silently from somewhere and was standing slightly behind and to the left of him with the expression she wore when she was deciding whether to trust something. He looked back at the woman Galina. "Sit down," he said. She sat today. She lowered the canvas bag carefully and opened it, and in the bag was 7 or 8 glass jars, sealed, and a cloth-wrapped parcel. She looked at the parcel, looked at them, looked at the parcel again. "Bread," she said. "It's from 3 days ago. It's not," she stopped. "It's bread." Grishko made a sound. "Thank you," Alexei said. She handed the parcel to him. He unwrapped it. It was a half-loaf, dark bread, dense, slightly stale in the way that bread 3 days old is slightly stale. He broke it into 5 pieces without thinking 5, because there were 5 of them, and then he looked at Galina and broke one of the pieces in half again and held one half out to her. She shook her head. "I've eaten." He kept his hand extended. She looked at him, at the bread, at him again. "I've eaten," she said again, but differently this time. He kept his hand out. She took the bread. They ate in silence. The mill held them in its great dark quiet. Outside, the fires continued their low, distant industry, and the artillery made its considered nighttime statements, and the river moved in the dark with its patient indifference. Galina ate her bread in small pieces, slowly, the way people eat when they are trying to make it last. Alexei watched her without appearing to watch her, in the way he had learned to observe things in this city, taking information in peripherally, without the direct gaze that cost something to hold. She was, he thought, remarkable, not in the way the word was usually used, not remarkable as a compliment, remarkable as an accurate observation. She was a person who remarked herself upon the situation, who left a mark on it by virtue of moving through it, by continuing to move through it, by carrying glass jars of food through contested streets at 2 in the morning to bring them to strangers in basements. The city was full of these people, he had come to understand. They did not appear in the dispatches. They did not receive designations or coordinates. They were simply present, in the rubble, doing the work of human continuity. "The people in the basements," Lazaeva said. "How many?" "On the western blocks. 40, perhaps 50. Old people, mostly. Some families. A few who couldn't get out when the crossing was possible." She paused. "They are managing. They've found water. They are frightened," but there she seemed to search for a word. "Organized," she said finally. "Russians organize when they are frightened. It's a national characteristic." Baranov made a sound that was adjacent to a laugh. "How long have you been doing this?" Alexei asked. "Since the 12th, she said. "Since the first bombardment." He calculated. 3 weeks. She had been moving through this city for 3 weeks, alone, with a bag of jars. "Where do you sleep?" Grishko asked. She looked at him with a young face. The earnest question and something in her expression shifted. "Wherever I am when I'm tired enough," she said. Not sadly. Simply. Grishko nodded as though this were a completely reasonable answer, which perhaps it was. They sat together in the mill for another hour. Not all of them awake, Grishko drifted back to sleep against the base of the machine, and Baranov returned to his watch position, and Laziva moved to the other sight line, and it was Alexei and Galina in the center of the shelter, not quite talking, not quite silent. She told him, in a low voice, about a cellar on Krasnaya Street where an old man had been keeping pigeons. Not eating them, keeping them. He had refused to leave the city without them and had been unable to take them across the river. And so he had stayed, and every morning he let them out to fly circuits above the ruined street, and every evening they came back. "Why does he keep them?" Alexei asked. "I asked him that," Galina said. "He said they knew the way home. He said he wanted to be somewhere that something knew the way home to." Alexei thought about this for a long time. He thought about the wheat fields, the curving path, the sound of laughter ahead. He thought about the river, moving in the dark. "Yes," he said eventually. "I understand that." She looked at him. In the ember glow her face was all warmth and shadow. "I thought you might," she said. Before dawn she was gone. She had basements to reach before the light made the streets dangerous, and she was apologetic about leaving, which seemed to Alexei characteristic of her in some essential way. She left 2 of the jars pickled vegetables, sealed with wax, and she left with 5 of them, for the people in the western basements. Alexei stood at the entrance gap and watched her go. She moved quickly now that she was outside, the civilian walk abandoned, something more purposeful and low to the ground taking its place. She was good at this. She had been at it for 3 weeks. She turned a corner and was gone. He stood there for a moment in the gray pre-dawn. Somewhere to the east, behind him, the sky was lightening. Not sunrise, yet not the sun itself, but the sky's anticipation of it. The darkness thinning at the horizon, the world beginning to reassemble itself from the darkness into which it had temporarily dissolved. He could hear the river now. He was almost sure of it. He breathed in cold air, ash, and underneath it, distantly, the smell of grain from the mill's old walls, rising with the temperature, releasing itself into the morning. He turned back inside. There was a day ahead. There was always a day ahead. The orders came at dawn. Not from a superior officer in person. There were no superior officers in person. Not in this part of the district. Not at this hour. They came the way orders often came now, through a chain of relay that had more in common with rumor than with command structure. A runner, appearing at the mill's eastern entrance with a slightly dazed quality of someone who had been moving fast through dangerous ground and had arrived somewhere safe and was not quite sure yet what to do with that. He was perhaps 17, small, with a face that had not yet finished deciding what it would look like, and boots that were too large for him and had been stuffed with cloth at the toes to compensate. He delivered his message in a low, rapid monotone that suggested he had rehearsed it many times during the journey and was now reciting rather than speaking. A section of the tractor factory on the northern edge of the mill district needed assessment. There was intelligence, qualified intelligence. The runner was careful to say, which in Alexei's experience meant intelligence that someone wanted to act on but was not prepared to stake anything significant on, that the Germans had established an observation post somewhere in the factory's upper structure. If confirmed, it would explain the accuracy of the artillery that had been targeting the ferry crossing to the south. The crossing that was, at this point, the primary means by which the 62nd Army received ammunition, reinforcements, everything that came across the Volga from the eastern bank. The runner looked at Alexei when he said this, as though the information about the crossing was the weight of the message, the part that mattered, and everything before it had been preamble. Alexei understood. The crossing was the thread. The crossing being cut meant the thread was cut, and the thread being cut meant something too large and too final to think about directly. So you didn't think about it directly. You thought about the observable, immediate task. You thought about the factory. He asked the runner 3 questions. How old was the intelligence? What was the last known German position to the north of the route? And was there a secondary route if the primary approach was compromised? The runner answered the first 2 adequately, and the third with a silence that was its own answer. Then the runner left, moving back the way he had come with the same rapid low movement, the oversized boots somehow not slowing him, and Alexei turned to the others. They were already looking at him. "Factory," he said. "North side of the district. Observation post. Possible upper levels. We assess and report." He looked at each of them in turn. Baranov, whose eyes were clear this morning, fully present. Last night's absence, a country he had returned from without explanation. Lazaeva, who had already, he noticed, adjusted her rifle's sling in the way she did when she was preparing to move. Grishko, who was eating the last of the bread from last night and had the expression of someone mentally preparing themselves, which in Grishko's case involved a visible internal conversation that showed on his face in small shifts, argument and resolution chasing each other across his features. Then there was the question of Galina. Galina was not there. Of course she had left before dawn, into the western streets with her canvas bag. But she was present nonetheless in the small way that people become present after a certain kind of conversation. The kind where something real has been said in the dark and the saying of it has left a trace. Alexei found himself, briefly, hoping she had reached her basement safely, and then set the thought down, because carrying it would cost him something he needed for other things. "How far?" Baranov asked. "Perhaps a kilometer," Alexei said. "Kilometer and a half. Open ground. Some. There's coverage along the mill wall for the first half." After that he paused. "We'll see." Baranov accepted this with a nod. "We'll see" was, in this city, a complete operational plan. They moved out at first light. The early morning had a quality Alexei had come to notice and almost look forward to, which felt like a strange thing to feel in this place but was nonetheless true. There was a brief period at dawn, perhaps 20 minutes, perhaps 30, when the city seemed to pause. The nighttime artillery had usually wound down by then, and the daytime operations had not yet fully begun, and in that gap the city rested, or seemed to, the way a person rests between one difficult thing and the next. The fire still burned. The smoke still pressed down. But the active, intentional violence of it took a breath. And in that breath you could move with something closer to freedom than any other time of day. They used the time well. The first section of the route was as Alexei had described. The long wall of the mill complex ran north, and they moved along its eastern face. In its shadow, the broken ground giving them intermittent cover where sections of the wall had shed their outer faces and created ledges and piles of brick that a person could move between without becoming a clear shape against the sky. Lazaeva led, Alexei behind her, then Grishko, then Baranov at the rear. The city was not empty in the mornings. This was something you understood only by moving through it. The popular image of a city under siege as a place evacuated of all civilian life was not accurate, or not entirely. There were still people. In the basements Galina had described, in the networks of cellars and tunnels that had developed beneath the worst-hit streets, connecting buildings underground when the streets above were impossible. Occasionally you caught evidence of them, a movement at a ground-floor window, a sound of coughing from beneath a grating, the specific quiet that a space makes when it is occupied but trying not to be. Once, rounding the northern end of the mill wall, they passed close to a cellar entrance, a hatch set into the pavement, its wooden cover cracked but intact, and from beneath it came the sound of a child talking. Not distressed, simply talking, in the way children talk when they are explaining something they find important, a low, continuous, earnest sound, and beneath that a woman's voice responding in short affirmations. Yes, yes, I see. Tell me more. They passed it and did not stop and did not look at each other. The open ground began where the mill district ended and the approach to the factory complex began. It was perhaps 200 meters of broken cityscape, not open in the countryside sense, not a field, but open in the urban sense, which meant without sufficient cover, which meant a crossing that required commitment and speed and the acceptance that for portions of it you would be visible, and the being visible would simply have to be a fact you carried across with you. There were 3 positions of cover on the far side: a collapsed section of the factory's outer boundary wall, a burned vehicle of some kind, origin and make unidentifiable, that sat in the middle of the approach like a large irregular rock, and a section of drainage ditch that ran along the factory's southern perimeter. Alexei studied the crossing from the corner of the mill wall. He was looking for the things that would tell him what he needed to know. The ground itself, what did it look like? Where were the loose sections, the unstable piles that would shift underfoot and make noise? The walls of the factory complex opposite, where were the windows, the apertures, the places from which an observer could observe? The sky, where was the light coming from? What were the shadows doing? Was there anything in the shadows that the shadows were not accounting for? He looked for a long time, long enough that Grishko shifted his weight once behind him. The vehicle first, Lazaeva said, beside him, not asking, offering. Yes, he said. Then the ditch. Move separately. 30 seconds between. She nodded. I'll go first, she said. He didn't argue. She was faster than him over broken ground, and she knew it, and he knew it, and arguing about it would have been vanity. She checked her rifle, looked at the crossing once more, and went. She moved low and fast. Not the sprint of a track, but the controlled acceleration of someone who has calculated exactly how fast they can move without sacrificing stability, who knows that a turned ankle here is not an inconvenience but a different kind of ending. Alexei watched her. He watched the factory windows. He watched the ground around her. She reached the vehicle, dropped into its shadow, went still. 30 seconds. Then she moved again, the last section to the drainage ditch, and then she was in it, below the surface of the approach, invisible. Go, Alexei said to Grishko. The boy went. He was not as smooth as Lazaeva. There was a moment in the middle of the crossing where he slipped on something, A brief controlled stumble that cost him half a second and a sharp intake of breath that Alexei could see from here, though not here, but he recovered and continued and reached the vehicle's shadow without incident. Then Baranov. Then Alexei. The crossing felt longer than it looked, the way these things always did. Time expanded in the open ground. Not metaphorically, something in the nervous system's processing of open ground genuinely slowed the passage of experience time, as though the body were insisting on taking in every detail of the exposure, cataloging it, holding it. He crossed in approximately 15 seconds. It felt like several minutes. He counted his breaths instead of the seconds and kept the count steady, and then he was in the ditch, and the ditch was narrow and smelled of standing water and rust and old things, and Lazareva was a meter to his right looking at him, and he gave her a nod. They were across. The factory wall was close now. The boundary section that had collapsed gave them access. They moved through it in single file, stepping over the tumbled bricks with the deliberate care of people who have learned what noise costs. Inside the factory perimeter, the world changed again. Every significant building in this city was its own distinct world once you were inside it. The mill had been vast and dark and smelled of grain. The apartment buildings they had moved through had been intimate and wrong, domestic spaces with their privacy destroyed, the small arrangements of people's lives exposed and abandoned. The factory was something else entirely. It was the largest roof space Alexei had ever been inside, larger even than the mill, and it was a space that had never been intended for human comfort or human scale. It had been built for machines and for the processes of machines, and the humans inside it had always been secondary to the work, present in service of the manufacturing rather than the other way around. What remained of it confirmed this impression. The scale was enormous, ceiling heights of 15, 20 meters in the main production halls, girders running overhead in a lattice of iron that had partially survived what the roof had not, so that you moved under a kind of skeleton, the bones of the building's original intention still visible above you while the flesh of it lay in pieces on the concrete floor. The machinery here was different from the mill, heavier, more specific, the machinery of tractor manufacture, which meant engines and chassis components and the vast press forms that had stamped metal into shape, several of which had fallen on their sides or had been dragged into new positions by whatever forces had moved through here. There were signs of recent habitation. A Russian position abandoned, Alexei assessed, within the past day or two. Ammunition casings on the floor. The remains of a fire, small and disciplined. A section of wall where someone had written names in charcoal, a column of them, 7 or 8, in different handwriting, which meant they had been added over time, which meant this had been a position for a while, which meant. He did not finish the thought. Up, said Lazareva. She was looking at the building's internal structure, the iron staircases, still largely intact, that rose along the eastern interior wall toward the upper levels and the partial roof. Yes, up was where an observation post would be. Up was what they had come to find. They began to climb. The stairs were solid, bolted to the wall, industrial and overbuilt in the way that manufacturing infrastructure was overbuilt, designed for decades of daily use by workers moving between levels with equipment and tools. They held. They were loud, the metal resonating underfoot despite their best efforts. Each step a small announcement, but there was no way around that, and they moved as quickly as they dared, which was not very quickly. The first level up gave them a view across the main production floor. The second gave them the factory's roofline, or what had been the roofline, now open in sections to the sky. The third level was a narrow walkway along the building's northern wall, with apertures every few meters that had been windows-framed openings, no glass remaining, looking north across the approach they had come from, and beyond it, across the mill district, across the streets, across the Volga bend where the city curved with the river. And there, the river. Alexei stood at one of the apertures and looked east and saw the Volga for the first time in 3 days. It was, as always, too large. The scale of it never settled comfortably into the mind. It simply sat there, refusing to be contained by perception, a fact of the landscape rather than a feature of it. In the morning light, with the smoke thinning slightly in the upper air, the river was broad and dark and moving with its eternal slow purpose, and on its far bank, the eastern bank, he could see the low line of the opposite shore, and on that shore, movement. The supply operations, the crossing, the thread that connected this city to everything behind it. He stood and looked at it for a long moment. Then he turned back to the task. The observation post, when they found it, was in the northwest corner of the third level, a careful arrangement of broken masonry and sheet metal that created a concealed position with a northwestward view, perfect for calling artillery onto the southern ferry approach. It was unoccupied, recently unoccupied. There were cigarette ends, German ones, a field ration wrapper, and the small indicators of habitual presence, a worn patch on the concrete floor, a mark on the wall at the height of a seated man's shoulder. They had been here. They were not here now. They'll come back, Baranov said. Yes, said Alexei. Tonight, most likely. Better dark for the crossing observation. Yes. He crouched in the observation post and looked through the aperture the way the Germans would look through it, angling his view to where the ferry crossing would be visible in the southwest. It was visible, clearly visible. He could see the approach, the bank, the narrow strip of water. He understood the artillery accuracy now completely and without ambiguity. He sat there for a moment. He was very tired. He had slept perhaps 3 hours in the past 2 days, and the crossing and the climb had asked something of his body that his body had given with the particular reluctant generosity of an account that is running low. Outside the aperture, a bird landed on a piece of protruding ironwork perhaps 2 meters away. A sparrow, or something like a sparrow, small, brown, ordinary in the way that sparrows are ordinary, which is to say completely and wonderfully without self-consciousness. It sat on the iron. It looked at him, or appeared to. It tilted its head the way birds tilt their heads, that quick interrogative movement that always looks like a question being formed. Alexei looked back at it. For a moment there was nothing in his mind. No calculation, no next step, no artillery grammar, no route assessment, no accounting of rounds and resources and angles. Just the bird, on the iron, in the morning light, looking at him. Then a sudden small movement of wings, and then gone, and the iron was empty. He breathed. "We need to get this back," he said. "Tonight changes things." "Yes," said Lazaeva. He looked at all of them, Baranov, Grishko, Lazaeva in the narrow walkway of the ruined factory, the Volga visible beyond them through the broken wall, the morning coming fully now, the smoke beginning to thicken again as the day warmed and the fires renewed themselves. "Good work," he said. It was a small thing to say. It was the right thing to say. Grishko looked at his boots. Baranov looked at the river. Lazaeva looked at Alexei with an expression that acknowledged the smallness of the words and found it sufficient. They began the long way back. The return crossing was harder. This was predictable. Alexei had known it would be harder before they attempted it, had filed the knowledge away during the outward crossing as a fact about the future that would need addressing when it arrived. The morning had fully established itself by the time they descended from the factory's third level and made their way back through the production floor. And with the morning had come the day's activity, which meant the quality of the silence outside had changed. It had a quiet attention, the particular taut quality of silence that exists when unseen eyes are somewhere nearby, and the silence is partly a product of their watchfulness. He felt it before he could have explained it. He stopped them at the factory boundary wall, at the gap they had entered through, and looked at the crossing. 200 meters of broken ground. The burned vehicle in the middle. The drainage ditch. In the morning light, it looked entirely different to how it had looked at first light. The shadows that had provided a regular cover were gone, replaced by the flat, even illumination of a sky that was bright without being sunny, the diffuse light of cloud and smoke combined that left no strong shadows anywhere and made everything equally, mercilessly visible. The ground between here and the mill wall was simply ground. It concealed nothing. He looked at the factory windows behind them, rechecked the northern approaches, looked at the mill wall opposite, looked at the sky. Separately, he said, "Maximum spacing. Don't stop at the vehicle. Go straight through to the ditch." "The ditch is exposed from the north for the last section," Lazarev said. "Yes. So we move fast through that section." "Yes." She looked at the crossing. He looked at her looking at it. She was doing the same calculation he had done, and reaching the same conclusions, and accepting the same uncomfortable remainder that the calculation left over the part that couldn't be solved for, only carried. "Grishko first," she said. He agreed. Not because Grishko was the most capable, he wasn't. Not yet, but because getting Grishko across and into cover first meant that for the crossings that followed there would be someone on the far side, watching, which was not nothing. He explained this to Grishko without explaining the reasoning. Simply, you go first, move fast, get into the ditch and watch the northern approach. Grishko's face moved through its internal conversation and arrived at readiness. He went. He was faster than Alexei had expected, faster than the previous crossing. Fear, perhaps, sharpening the body's responses. Or something else, something that looked from the outside like courage, which Alexei had come to understand was often indistinguishable from fear that has been given a direction and a task. Grishko crossed in something under 15 seconds and was in the drainage ditch without incident. And Alexei watched the factory windows the whole time, and they remained empty, which was not the same as safe but was adjacent to it. Then Baranov, then Lazarev, then Alexei. He moved. The open ground had the quality it always had, the expansion of time, the body insisting on cataloging every detail of the exposure. He counted his breaths, kept the count steady. His boots found the ground and left it and found it again, and he moved in the particular not-quite run of this city, the controlled low acceleration that was faster than walking and less foolish than sprinting. He was in the middle of the crossing when the sound changed. Not a shot, not an explosion, a different sound, the sound of a vehicle engine, somewhere to the north, and with it the lowest sound of boots on rubble, multiple boots, the cadence of a group moving with purpose. Moving south, moving, in other words, toward him. He did not stop. Stopping in the open ground was not an option, because stopping in the open ground was just being in the open ground for longer, and longer was wise. He continued moving, modified his angle slightly to reach the drainage ditch at a point further east than he had planned, and went into it with more force than elegance, the impact jarring his knees, and pressed himself flat against the western bank of the ditch. The others were already flat. None of them spoke. None of them needed to. The sounds from the north grew. The vehicle, he could hear it more clearly now. Something light, a personnel carrier or motorcycle with a sidecar, and with it the boots, perhaps 8 to 10 sets of them, moving at a pace that was not patrol pace, that was operational pace, the pace of people going somewhere specific to do something specific. Through the lip of the drainage ditch, Alexei raised his head by centimeters. A German column, moving south along the factory perimeter road. 8 soldiers on foot, and behind them a motorcycle combination sidecar mounted with a light machine gun. The gunner sitting with the professional patience of someone who has been in this position for many hours and expects to be in it for many more. They were moving south, which meant toward the mill district, which meant toward the position they had spent the night in. He watched them. They moved with the efficiency of people who owned the ground they were moving on, which in the military sense they did and in the human sense they did not. And Alexei felt the specific anger of that, the quiet, cold, particular anger that was not the hot, sudden anger of immediate confrontation, but something more durable, more load-bearing, the anger that had been doing structural work in him for months without his having named it as anger. He watched and did not move and did not breathe more than minimally. The column passed. The sound of it moved south. And then the sound diminished, and then the city's ambient sound reclaimed it, and the column was gone. Another minute of absolute stillness. Then Lazarev, very quietly, there at the mill. He had already calculated this. The column's pace, the direction, the distance from the mill, yes. They were at the mill, or close to it. The shelter that had been theirs last night was no longer theirs. The runner's route, Baranov said. Low, careful. Where did he come from? East, Alexei said. There's a position on Artilleriskaya. If we can reach it. How far? From here 600 meters, perhaps 7. A pause. The ditch was narrow and the 4 of them in it were close together. Their voices barely sound. Their faces close enough that Alexei could see the dust in Lazarev's eyelashes, the particular set of Baranov jaw that he was learning to read as determination rather than fear. Then we go east, said Lazarev. They went east. The route was not direct. Nothing in this city was direct. Direct being a concept that belonged to a world with intact roads and an absence of machine gun nests. They moved through the rubble of what had been a residential block on the mill district's eastern edge, threading between collapsed sections, climbing where they had to, descending where they had to, maintaining the low, patient forward movement that was the city's primary mode of transit. An hour of this, perhaps more. They spoke very little. There was a section of open ground near a ruined tram depot that cost them 20 careful minutes to navigate without exposure, moving along a trench improvised from collapsed drainage infrastructure, their boots in several inches of dark water, the smell of it rich and unhealthy. Grishko, in front of Alexei for this section, moved with the sustained focus that Alexei had come to trust entirely. The boy had not failed him once, not in any significant way, and he had stopped thinking of him as a problem to be managed and had begun thinking of him as simply one of the 4, one of the people he was moving through this with. They reached Artilleriskaya in the early afternoon. The position that was more established than their mill shelter had been a proper dugout in the basement of a still partially standing apartment building, sandbagged at the entrance, with a communications line running east toward the river. There were 12 men there under a lieutenant named Ostrovsky, who was 26 and had the eyes of someone who had been in Stalingrad since before the German advance reached the city. He heard Alexei's report about the factory observation post, asked 3 precise questions, and then sent a runner east with the information. Then he looked at the 4 of them. "You came from the mill," he said. "Yes," said Alexei. "There's a column moving through the mill district. We saw them." Ostrovsky nodded slowly. He had the manner of a man who processes information without visible reaction, which Alexei recognized as a particular form of discipline, the discipline of not spending emotional energy on things already done, only on things still possible. He respected it without being able to fully emulate it. "Stay," Ostrovsky said. "Rest. There'll be something for you to do tonight." They found space in the dugout's eastern corner, beside a section of foundation wall that still held its brick above their heads, and they settled that word again, that accurate word, and for a while they simply existed without moving, which was its own profound relief. Food came. Not much, a ladle of something that had been soup before it became whatever it currently was, thick and dark, and served in a tin cup that went from hand to hand. Black bread. A piece of sausage divided among them with the mathematical precision of people who have stopped having feelings about food and have only arithmetic remaining. They ate. And then, in the late afternoon dim of the dugout, with the sounds of the city continuing their grammar above and around them, Baranov spoke. He spoke the way he had spoken the previous night, the same considered, theatrical delivery. The voice of a man who has done the work of deciding to say something before he says it. He looked at the tin cup in his hands. "My wife is in Saratov," he said, "with our daughters. 2 daughters." He paused. "Masha is 11. Vera is 8. Alexei looked at him. "They got out on the 23rd of August, Baranov continued, the day of the first bombardment. I put them on a boat in the morning, and I watched it cross, and when it reached the other side, they were so small I couldn't see them anymore." He turned the tin cup in his hands. "I've thought about that a great deal. That moment when they became too small to see." No one spoke. "I think about what Masha is doing," he said. "She would be in school, probably. She's very serious about school. Very diligent. She worries about her marks." A pause. "I find that remarkable now, that she worries about her marks. I find it the most extraordinary thing." "Why?" Grishko said. Genuine, unguarded. Baranov looked at him. "Because it means that somewhere there is still a world in which marks matter, in which a child can worry about whether she has understood her mathematics correctly, and that worry is the weight of the day." He looked back at the tin cup. "That world is still happening. Right now, at this moment. Masha is worrying about her marks, and Vera is probably drawing. She draws constantly. Everything. The edge of any piece of paper she finds, and that is happening. Simultaneously with this." He gestured, very slightly, at the dugout, at the sounds above, at all of it. The silence that followed was different from other silences. It had a texture of recognition in it, the recognition of something true having been said, and the way true things create a brief stillness around themselves. "My mother," Grishko said, after a moment. He stopped, started again. "My mother doesn't know I'm here. She thinks I'm still east of the Don. I didn't want to." He stopped again. "She worries. She is always worried about everything. Even before the war, she worried. The neighbors used to call her the worry." He looked at his hands. I used to find it embarrassing. I used to wish she would stop." He paused. "I would give a great deal to have her worry about me now." Laziva reached over and put her hand briefly on his arm. Not a gesture of comfort exactly, or not only that. The gesture of a person who has heard something and wants to confirm that it has been heard, that it has arrived somewhere and been received. Grishko looked at her hand and then at the wall. Alexei thought about what he would say if he were going to say something. He thought about Miranovka, about the crooked chimney, about the wheat fields in July and his mother's kitchen and Doria who laughed too loudly and the particular yellow of the morning light through the east window, the color that existed nowhere else on earth, that had no name, that was only itself and only that room and only that specific hour. He thought about what he was fighting for. He had heard the question framed publicly, officially the speeches, the dispatches, the language of duty and motherland and historical necessity. He believed in all of that, in the broad strokes of it, in the same way he believed in geography. It was true, it was real, it was the largest frame. But it was not what he was actually fighting for, not in the moment of fighting, not in the crossing or the watching or the 30-second intervals between. In those moments the frame was too large to see. What he was actually fighting for was smaller and more specific and more absolute. He was fighting for the yellow of the light through the east window. He was fighting for the sound of the cast iron pot on the stove. He was fighting for the wheat fields, not as symbol, but as actual wheat field specific, located, seated and growing and waiting. He was fighting for Doria's laugh, which was too loud and which he had not heard in 14 months and which was in some file of his memory marked with a particularity that nothing else in his life had acquired. He was fighting for the crooked chimney that his father had never fixed and now never would fix because his father was gone. And the chimney was there, and the not fixing of it was his father's last action in relation to the chimney. And that was what fathers were, the sum of the things they hadn't done, preserved in the things they hadn't fixed. He was fighting for that. And for the river, not the Volga as strategic asset, not the Volga as the reason for Stalingrad's importance, but the Volga as the thing you could hear on quiet nights if you listened for it, the thing that kept moving regardless, the thing that did not stop for any of this. He didn't say any of this. He said, "I think we're fighting for the same thing, ultimately. All of us, whatever word we put around it." Baranov looked at him. "Yes," he said, "I think that's probably right." They were quiet for a while. Above them, the city continued its work. The artillery made its evening statements. The fires renewed themselves. The smoke pressed down on everything. And then, from somewhere further along the dugout from among Ostrovsky's men, someone Alexei could not see, a voice began, very quietly, to sing. It was a song he knew, a song almost everyone in Russia knew, a folk song, old enough that its origin was argument rather than fact, slow and modal and built on a melody that did what all the best folk melodies do, that went somewhere sad and came back through somewhere else entirely, so that the ending was not the same emotional place as the beginning, but was perhaps a place you could rest. No one joined in, but no one told the voice to stop. It sang its song in the dim of the dugout, while outside Stalingrad continued, and they listened, and the song did its work, and somewhere across the city an old man's pigeons were folded in the dark, knowing the way home. Ostrovsky briefed them at dusk. He did it quietly, without drama, in the manner of a man who has given many briefings and has arrived at the understanding that clarity is more valuable than inspiration, that the soldiers in front of him need information arranged usefully rather than emotion arranged persuasively. He crouched on the dugout floor with a piece of broken brick and drew on the concrete the factory outline, the approach route, the position of the observation post on the third level, the angles. The plan was not complicated. Plans that worked in Stalingrad were not complicated because complexity required coordination and coordination required communication, and communication in this city was fragile in ways that made elaborate plans expensive. The plan was, a small group would return to the factory and remove the observation post capacity to function. Remove was Ostrovsky's word, and it was the right word more specific than destroy, which implied the building, and more honest than neutralize, which was the word that kept a clean distance from what it actually meant. Alexei's group plus 2 of Ostrovsky's men. The 2 men were named Fedorov and Chernov, and they had been in the position on Artillery Iskaya for 9 days, which in the context of Stalingrad in August of 1942 made them veterans. Fedorov was broad and quiet with a stillness to him that Alexei recognized as the stillness of someone who has found the right relationship with fear, not its absence, not its conquest, but a working arrangement, a negotiated coexistence. Chernov was thinner, quicker in his movements, with a habit of touching the collar of his uniform tunic when he was processing something, a small self-soothing gesture so habitual he was clearly unaware of it. They reviewed the route. They discussed the crossing Alexei described. Ostrovsky's men listened, asked 2 questions, accepted the answers. They discussed the factory interior, the staircase, the third-level walkway, the observation post position. They discussed contingencies, which were limited and honest. If the post was occupied in force, they withdrew. If the route to the factory was blocked, they withdrew. If any one of them became unable to move, the others continued. These were not cold calculations, or not only cold calculations. They were the acknowledgement that the mission existed at a different scale than any individual in it, and that the individual, in service of the mission, accepted this temporarily and provisionally, and everyone in the dugout understood this, and no one needed to say it aloud. They moved out at 9 o'clock. The Stalingrad night had fully established itself, the ember glow of burning districts painting the underside of the smoke in shifting oranges and reds, the sky above the smoke itself invisible. The stars that existed somewhere above the cloud and smoke existing in a different world entirely, a world of astronomy and navigation that had nothing to do with what was happening below. The light on the ground was sufficient and strange, the kind of light that existed nowhere else on Earth, that had been created by this specific catastrophe and would vanish with it. They moved in a line, spaced, the spaces between them wide enough that a single event would not encompass all of them. Alexei had noted, over the weeks, the way a group moving at night through danger developed a kind of collective sensitivity, a distributed nervous system, each person contributing their own angle of attention, the sum of those angles creating a field of awareness wider than any individual could sustain alone. He felt it now, moving along the eastern wall of what had been a machine workshop, the 6 of them threading between the obstacles with the automatic coordination of people who have briefed the same route and whose bodies have absorbed the briefing and are now executing it below the level of conscious decision. Left at the collapsed tram shelter, straight through the gap in the workshop wall, right along the drainage ditch that still held its dark water and its smell of old rot. The city moved around them. This was the phrase he had developed for it. The city moves because the city was not static at night, was not a fixed obstacle course through which you navigated. It was itself in motion, subtly and continuously, in ways that had nothing to do with the Germans or the Russians and everything to do with the accumulated damage of weeks of bombardment. Buildings shifted, debris settled. The thermal changes of day to night caused stress structures to make sounds groaning, ticking, the occasional slow creak of metal cooling that required identification before you could move past them. A sound could be a building or it could be a person, and the difference required attention and time, and sometimes the stopping of all six of them in a darkness while Alexei or Lazueva listened with the particular quality of listening that the city had taught them. They reached the crossing point in 40 minutes. He looked at it. The vehicle was still there, the boned shape of it, sitting in the middle of the approach, now lit faintly on its western face by the glow from the north. The drainage ditch lay beyond it, the factory wall beyond that. The same crossing, the same 200 meters, but wearing its night version, which was both easier and harder. Easier because the diffuse light made precise observation more difficult. Harder because the same diffuse light made the open ground feel more exposed rather than less, the imagination filling the dimness with a watching presences it could not prove weren't there. He turned to the others and held up 2 fingers. Pairs. They would cross in pairs, close together, full speed. He went with Lazueva. They crossed. The ground gave nothing away. They moved through it, reached the vehicle's shadow, kept moving, reached the ditch, went into it. Clean. Fedorov and Chernov. Then Baranov and Grishko. All 6 in the ditch. All 6 breathing. All 6 present. Alexei allowed himself a fraction of relief, not the full weight of it, just a fraction. Enough to acknowledge that the crossing had gone as planned without allowing the acknowledgement to soften anything. They moved to the factory wall, through the gap, across the production floor. The factory at night was a different place again, larger, somehow, than it was in daylight. The dark resolving the industrial scale into something more absolute, the ceiling girders invisible above. The machines around them, vast dark shapes that the imagination could make into anything. Alexei kept his attention on the known things. The floor, the eastern wall, the staircase ahead. They climbed. He was more aware of the noise on the stairs at night, each footstep on the metal tread sounding, to his heightened attention, considerably louder than he knew it actually was. He pressed each foot down slowly, rolling from heel to toe, distributing the impact, the others behind him doing the same. It was slow. The 2 flights felt like 10. The second level. He stopped, held up his fist. Everyone stopped. He listened. Above them, on the 3rd level, something. Not a sound exactly, or not a clear sound. More the quality of the silence above them, which was different from the quality of the silence below. The silence above had the texture of occupied space. He had no scientific basis for this claim. He had only the accumulated weeks of listening in this city, and the accumulated weeks told him, there is someone on the 3rd level. He turned to Lazueva. She was already looking at him. She had heard it too, or felt it too, whatever the right word was. He held up fingers. 1, 2, maybe 3. He made a questioning gesture. She held up 2 fingers with more certainty than he had managed. 2. She was probably right. He turned to Fedorov, who was immediately behind him, and made the same gesture. Fedorov looked up toward the 3rd level and then back at Alexei and nodded. Once, with the settled expression of a man completing a calculation that produces an unpleasant but workable answer. They arranged themselves at the top of the second-level staircase. The approach to the third-level staircase was through a section of open walkway, perhaps 8 meters of it, with the factory floor visible 15 meters below through a gap in the walkway's edge. Then the staircase up, then the third-level walkway, and at its northwest corner, the observation post. Alexei went first across the open walkway. He moved as slowly as speed permitted, quickly enough that the exposure was short, slowly enough that his footfalls could be controlled. He reached the staircase base and pressed against the wall beside it and looked up. The observation post was lit. Not brightly. A shielded lamp of some kind, pointed downward, designed to be invisible from outside. But the light crept under the sheet metal that formed the post's forward wall and found the edges of the third-level walkway and lay there in thin lines. 2 of those lines were interrupted. Boots. 2 sets of feet. 2 men. Inside the post, sitting or crouching, facing northwest toward the ferry crossing, doing the work they had been sent here to do. He went back to the staircase base. The others came across one by one. He arranged them in the narrow space. What happened next was brief. He would think about it afterward. He would think about it many times, in the weeks and months and possibly years to come, in whatever form the future took, and it would remain, in memory, brief. Not because it was small, because extreme events compress in the memory differently than ordinary ones, the detail not expanding outward with time the way pleasant memories expand, but condensing, becoming denser, the sequence of it collapsing until what remains is a series of instants without the tissue of ordinary time connecting them. They went up the stairs. The 2 German soldiers young, he registered, younger than he had expected. One of them, almost Grishko's age, became aware of them in the final moment before the moment was decided. He saw the recognition in the nearer one's face. The instant of it. The expression that a human face makes when it understands something irrevocable is happening, which is unlike any other expression a human face makes, and which Alexei would not describe because there were no words that did the job without either overclaiming or underclaiming, without either making it into something cinematic or making it into something less than it was. It was over quickly. He would not write those words in a letter. He would not say them to Grishko or Baranov. He would not perform the hardness of them, because performing hardness was its own kind of dishonesty. What he would do, in the walkway of the third level of the factory, in the aftermath of the brief thing that had happened, was stand with it. Simply stand with the weight of it and not put it down and not dress it in language it didn't fit. 2 men had been here. 2 men were not here now. The observation post was disassembled. The lamp, the equipment, the careful arrangements of the position methodically and thoroughly. Not with anger, with the particular deliberate attention of people doing necessary work. Each movement is considered and complete. Fedorov, working beside him, did not speak. His face was the face of a man who has done this before and has found his way to the same place Alexei was finding, the place of simply standing with it, of doing the work without the commentary that the work did not need. Chernov, at the staircase head keeping watch, touched his collar twice. 3 times, then stopped. Grishko did not speak either. Alexei watched him in his peripheral vision and saw the boy's face moving through something, not the internal conversation of fear this time, but something slower and more permanent. The expression of someone who has passed a threshold and knows it and is taking the measure of the new ground on the other side. He was doing it quietly. He was doing it without falling apart. This was, Alexei thought, the most important thing Grishko would do tonight, and it had nothing to do with the task. When it was done, they came down the stairs and crossed the factory floor and moved through the gap in the boundary wall and into the city. They crossed the open ground. The return route through the mill district felt longer than the approach. The way return journeys always feel longer, the anticipation of arrival extending the middle sections, the body's awareness that safety is closer, creating an impatience that the discipline of the past weeks managed but could not quite suppress. Alexei counted his breaths and kept the count steady and did not let his pace increase. An hour and 20 minutes after leaving the factory, they were back in the dugout on Artilleriskaya. Ostrovsky received the report with the same even manner in which he had given the briefing. He asked his 3 questions. He sent the runner. He looked at the 6 of them. "Rest," he said. They rested. Alexei sat against the foundation wall in the corner he had claimed and put his back against the brick and felt the brick's solidity through his coat and stayed with that for a while. The solid thing. The present thing. The thing that was simply there. Lazaeva sat nearby. Not beside him, near him. There was a distinction, and it was the right one. Near enough that he was aware of her presence, which was itself a kind of company, the company of a known person simply existing in the same space, which was different from and more valuable than any conversation. After a long silence, she said, quietly, "Are you all right?" He considered the question. "Yes," he said. She looked at him. "Not entirely," he said. "No," she said. "Not entirely." They sat with that. The honesty of it, and the sufficiency of the honesty, the way saying the true thing, even the difficult true thing, created a small space of breathable air. From across the dugout, Baranov's voice, very low, "My father was a soldier. The previous war. He never spoke about it. Not once, in all the years I knew him. I used to find this strange. I used to wish he had spoken about it." A pause. "I understand it now." No one responded to this immediately. Then Grishko, from his corner, with the particular careful tone of someone saying something they have thought about for a long time and are only now finding the moment for. "He wasn't protecting you." Was he? He was protecting it, keeping it separate. A silence. "Yes," said Baranov. "I think that's exactly right." Alexei closed his eyes. He thought about the wheat fields. He thought about the curving path and the sound of laughter ahead and the fact that in the dream he was always walking toward it and never arriving, which was not a cruel thing but simply the nature of dreams, that they held the direction without the destination. And perhaps that was enough. Perhaps the direction was the thing. He thought about Galina, moving through the western streets with her canvas bag of jars. He thought about the old man's pigeons, turning in circuits above the ruined street, returning each evening to the place that knew them. He thought about Masha doing her mathematics and Vera drawing on the edges of any piece of paper she could find, and the extraordinary ordinary fact that this was happening right now, simultaneously, in the same world. He thought about the river. He was almost asleep when he felt, faintly through the earth, the percussion of an artillery round somewhere to the south. Then another. Then silence. Then the river, or the idea of the river, the sound he had decided to believe was real, moving in the dark with its patient and indifferent continuity. He slept. He did not dream of the wheat fields this time. He dreamed of nothing, which was its own mercy, the deep, dreamless sleep of a body that has spent everything it had and has been given, provisionally and without guarantee, the chance to begin refilling. Outside, Stalingrad continued. It always continued. That was the terrible and somehow sustaining thing about it. It continued, and you continued inside it, and the continuing was the whole of what was asked of you. And when you had given it, you slept, and when you had slept, the continuing was there again, patient and absolute, waiting for you to take it up. He slept. He woke to the smell of something burning that was not the city. It took him a moment to identify that particular transition from sleep to waking where the senses send their information ahead of the mind's capacity to interpret it, so that for a brief interval the world is simply sensation without meaning, warmth and light and smell existing without context or name. And then the context assembled itself, the way it always did, in the specific order it always did. The dugout, the brick, the sounds of the city above, the weight of the rifle across his legs where it had slid in the night. And then the smell again, more specifically. Not the city. Something smaller and more deliberate. Tea. Someone, somewhere in the dugout, had made tea. He opened his eyes. One of Ostrovsky's men, not Fedorov, not Chernov, one of the others, a young soldier with a wide, honest face that Alexei had not learned the name of, was crouching over a small iron pot balanced on an improvised heat source, a section of metal pipe with something burning slowly inside it, the whole arrangement producing a modest and careful heat that was enough, just enough, for the purpose. The soldier was watching the pot with the focused attention of someone entrusted with something important, which in this context he was. Alexei watched him for a moment. There was something he did not have the right word for it, and suspected the right word did not exist, at least not in any language. He spoke something in the simple act of the boy watching the pot. Something in the concentration of it, the way the whole of his attention had been brought to bear on this small domestic task, as though it were the most important thing currently happening in Stalingrad, which in the most immediate and local sense it was. Tea was being made. The boy was making it. The morning was, in this tiny radius, simply a morning in which tea was being made. Alexei sat up. His body reported its inventory. The stiffness of a night on concrete, the specific ache of his left shoulder where he had slept on it wrongly, the dull background weight of accumulated exhaustion that was no longer acute, had become simply the medium in which he existed, the water he swam in. He catalogued this without complaint. Complaint required an audience and a belief that the situation could be otherwise, and he had neither. Lazaeva was already awake, sitting with her back to the wall, looking at nothing in particular with the expression of someone in the midst of extended internal thought. Baranov was asleep, his breathing the slow, regular breathing of genuine deep sleep, his face in sleep younger than his face awake. Grishko Alexei looked for him and found him at the dugout entrance, sitting with his back to the sandbags, looking out at the morning. He went and sat beside him. Grishko did not look at him. He was looking at the street, which was visible in a narrow band from their position, a section of Arturiiska, rubble-strewn, empty. The buildings on the far side a mix of standing and collapsed, a dentist-gap streetscape against a sky that was slightly clearer this morning than it had been, the smoke thinned by a wind off the steppe that had come in the night. "How do you do it?" Grishko said, not looking at him. Alexei waited. Afterward, Grishko said, "How do you keep it separate?" Like Baranov said, his father. He thought about this carefully, not because he didn't have an answer, but because he wanted to give the right one, the one that was actually true rather than the one that sounded true, which were often different things and which the boy deserved to have distinguished between. I don't think you keep it separate, he said, after a moment. I think you carry it with you. And it's heavy, and it stays heavy. But you get stronger, a little, and the weight doesn't change, but your capacity for it changes. Grishko was quiet. Does it get easier? He said. No, Alexei said. But you get better at it, which is different. Another silence. My mother is going to ask me about it, Grishko said. When I'm home, she's going to want to know. He paused. She'll think she wants to know. She'll think knowing is better than not knowing. Maybe it is, Alexei said. Maybe, said Grishko. But he said it the way you say a word when you are trying it out and finding it doesn't quite fit. The young soldier appeared with the tea. He distributed it in whatever vessels were available: 2 proper cups, a tin mug, a mess tin, a ceramic bowl that had appeared from somewhere. He distributed it without ceremony and with complete equality, the same amount to each person. And he looked at each person as he handed it to them with the same brief, direct look, as though confirming their existence, as though the tea were partly the point and partly an excuse for the confirmation. Alexei received his tin mug and held it in both hands and felt the warmth of it come through his palms and move up his arms, and it was, in the specific language of that morning, everything. He drank. It was not good tea. It was tea that had been made with limited materials under difficult conditions with insufficient water temperature, and it tasted of metal and of something faintly smoky that was probably the heat source rather than the tea itself. It was the best thing he had tasted in 2 weeks. Ostrovsky came through the dugout mid-morning with the information that the German column that had moved through the mill district the previous day had established a position in the northern section, but had not pressed further east. The mill itself was occupied. The shelter where they had spent their first night was gone. Whatever meaning gone had in this context, but the line further east was stable, or as stable as anything in this city was stable, which meant it was not actively collapsing. There was nothing specific for Alexei's group to do that morning. He took this information and turned it over and accepted it, which required a small act of discipline because the rhythm of the past days had conditioned him to purposeful movement, and purposeful movement had its own logic and momentum, and stopping felt like a gap in a sentence, a pause where the meaning should be. But the pause was real, and real pauses needed to be inhabited rather than filled, and so he gathered the 4 of them and said simply, "We have the morning." They looked at him as though this required translation. "Rest," he said. "Walk if you need to move. Stay east. Stay covered." Lazaeva understood first. She always understood first. The slight adjustment in her face that meant she had processed something and found it acceptable. Then Baranov, who simply nodded and returned to his section of wall and sat down with the settled quality of a man who knows how to rest when resting is possible. Grishko looked uncertain for a moment longer, then found a section of the dugout where the light came through a gap in the ceiling and sat in it. In the light, his face tilted slightly upward. Alexei went east. He went alone, which felt unusual. He had been with the group almost continuously, and the aloneness was strange, had the quality of a room you have been in many times but are visiting empty for the first time. The streets on Artilleriiskaya's eastern end were quieter than the mill district. Not safe, nothing was safe, but quieter, with longer intervals between sounds, the damage here more historical and less immediate. The buildings destroyed but not recently destroyed, already settled into their new forms rather than in the process of becoming them. He moved east. The Volga grew louder. He had been hearing it or believing he was hearing it for days now, the low continuous sound of it under everything, the sound he oriented by. But as he moved east, the sound became less ambiguous, more clearly itself and not the wind or the settling of rubble or the imagination working on the silence. It was the river, the actual river, the moving of a vast amount of water over a stone bed, the sound that rivers have made since rivers existed, which preceded everything else he could name by enough time that the naming felt presumptuous. Road, and there it was, the Volga. He had seen it from the factory and had seen it as geography, as strategic fact, as the thing the city was organized around and in relation to. But seeing it from the factory's third level at a distance of 800 meters was different from standing at its edge. Standing at its edge was different in a way that exceeded the difference in distance. Up close, the river was not a feature of the landscape. It was the landscape. It occupied the whole of the eastward view, bank to invisible bank, the far eastern shore so distant in the morning haze that it existed as a suggestion rather than a certainty, a slightly different shade of gray where water became land. He stood on the broken embankment and looked at it. The Volga here was moving south, as it always moved south, as it had moved south for longer than anyone could meaningfully conceive. The surface of it was not the flat mirror of still water, but the textured, living surface of a river in movement, the patterns of current visible in the way the light caught it differently across its width, the darker lines where the water ran deepest and fastest, the lighter sections near the banks where it shallowed and slowed, the whole surface in a state of constant and complex motion that looked like something breathing. There were boats on it, small ones, not the larger ferries that ran at night with supplies, but smaller craft, moving in both directions with the specific purposefulness of things that know where they are going and are going there regardless. He watched them for a moment. They moved across the water with an indifference to the city that was not callousness but simply the indifference of people who have a river to cross and are crossing it, which had been true on this river for centuries and would be true after this was over, in whatever form after took. He sat down on a broken section of embankment wall. He sat there for a long time. The sounds of the city were behind him, still present, still their familiar selves, the percussion and the settling and the ambient suffering of it all, but ahead was the river, and the river's sound was different. Older. The river's sound did not contain urgency. It did not contain fear or calculation or the grammar of artillery. It contained only itself, the simple fact of its moving, the water that had been rain in the north becoming current in the south, becoming sea eventually, the whole long patient journey of it, indifferent to the human events on its western bank in the way that something genuinely ancient is indifferent, not hostile, not dismissive, simply operating at a scale on which the current moment did not register. He thought about his father. His father had taken him to see the Don River once, when Alexei was perhaps 7 years old, a long journey by cart to reach the bank. And when they had arrived, his father had stood at the water's edge for a long time without speaking. Alexei had stood beside him, patient in the way that children are patient with their father's silences, when the silence is a quality that tells the child this is not absence but presence of a different kind. And then his father had said, "You see how it doesn't stop. You see how it just keeps going." He had been 7. He had looked at the river. He had seen how it just kept going. He had not understood what his father meant. He understood now. He thought about all of it, sitting on the broken embankment in the relative quiet of the river's edge. He thought about Miranovka and the wheat in the kitchen and the chimney and Doria and his father and his mother and the east window and the specific color of the morning light through it, the color that had no name. He thought about Grishko and Baranov and Laziva and the long specific thread of the past days, the decisions and the crossings and the staircase and the factory and the bird on the iron and the bread divided and the tea in the tin mug and Galina moving through the dark with her canvas bag of jars. He thought about all of it and let it sit in him without trying to arrange it, without trying to resolve it into meaning or lesson or conclusion. It sat in him as it was complicated and heavy and also, in some way that he could not have defended logically, sufficient. The weight of it was also the fullness of it. The carrying of it was also the living of it. The river moved. He heard footsteps behind him and did not tense, because he knew those footsteps. He had memorized them without trying over the past days, the way you memorize the sounds of people you spend concentrated time with. Laziva sat down beside him. She looked at the river. He looked at the river. For a while neither of them said anything, which was exactly the right thing. Then she said, "I used to bring my class to the river near Leninsk. In the spring, we would read outside." "What did you read?" "Chekhov, usually." It seemed right, outside. He was better outside. "Why?" She considered. Because he wrote about people in relation to things larger than themselves. The land, the weather, the passage of time. Inside, those things feel abstract. Outside, with the actual land around you and the actual sky, the abstraction becomes concrete. The children felt it. She paused. Some of them, anyway. The ones who were ready to feel it. He thought about this, about children sitting by a river with Chekhov, feeling the large things become concrete. "What will you teach them when this is over?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "The same things," she said, "but differently. I think I'll teach them Chekhov first now, not last. I used to save him for the older ones, the ones who I thought could handle the complication. But I think I was wrong about that. I think younger children can handle it better, because they haven't yet learned that complication is supposed to be difficult." She looked at the river. "I'll teach them that the river doesn't stop, that that's not a metaphor, or not only a metaphor, that it's a fact, and the fact is available to them, and they can return to it whenever they need to." He listened to her say this. He stored it in the same place he stored the things that mattered, not a decision, just a recognition, the way you recognize something true when you hear it, a slight internal settling. They were sitting like that, the two of them, watching the river, when Alexei became aware of a figure on the embankment to the south. Moving north, a slight figure, moving with purpose, carrying a canvas bag on one shoulder. He looked. She saw him at the same moment and stopped. A pause across the distance. Then Galina raised her hand. Not a wave, not the broad social gesture of a wave. Simply a raising of a hand. An acknowledgement. "I see you. You are there. This is noted." He raised his. She lowered hers and kept walking north, the bag on her shoulder, her pace unchanged, her direction fixed, the work she was doing continuing as it continued, as it had continued, as it would continue for as long as she could make it continue. He watched her go. "She's remarkable," Laziva said. "Yes," he said. They watched until she was out of sight, around the gentle curve of the embankment where the river bent slightly and the buildings came closer to the bank and swallowed the view. Then they looked at the river again. The afternoon light was changing, not the sharp amber of early evening yet, but the beginning of that movement, the light starting its long, slow shift toward the end of the day, the shadows beginning to lean eastward toward the far bank and the country beyond it that was not this. The river caught the changing light and held it differently in different sections, dark where the current ran deepest, almost silver where it shallowed near the bank, the whole surface remaking itself with a light the way rivers are always remaking themselves, never the same water twice, never the same light twice, only the river itself remaining continuous in the midst of all the change. It doesn't stop, his father had said. You see how it just keeps going. Alexei looked at the Volga, and it looked back at him in the way that large things look back, not with attention, not with recognition, but with the simple, undeniable fact of its presence, which was its own form of answer. He breathed in. Cold air. The smell of the river, mineral and alive, entirely unlike the smells of the city behind him. The smell of water moving over stone, ancient and clean. He breathed out. Behind him, Stalingrad continued. Ahead of him, the river continued. He sat between them and was, for this hour, simply present. Not a soldier making calculations. Not a man cataloging ammunition and angles and routes. Simply a person sitting at the edge of a river in the afternoon light, with another person beside him, and the river doing what rivers do. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in the specific language of this specific day, everything that was available, and he received it with both hands. They walked back from the river in the early evening. Not quickly. There was no urgency in it. The afternoon had given them that. The hour by the water had given them that. The quality of slowness that settles into a person when they have been in the presence of something large and patient and indifferent to hurry. They walked the way people walk when they are not performing movement but simply moving, the body finding its own pace. The mind present but not pressed. The city received them back as it always did, without welcome and without hostility, simply as a fact, the way a river receives a stone dropped into it, closing over the disturbance and continuing. The streets of the Eastern District were quieter in the evening than they had been at midday. The percussion to the west had settled into its nighttime register, the considered and deliberate statements of the dark hours, and the light was doing its final work, the amber deepening toward the copper of last light, the shadows long and eastward, the smoke above catching the last of it and holding it in orange and red layers that were, in the way this city was always terrible and sometimes terrible and beautiful simultaneously, extraordinary to look at. Alexei did not try not to find it beautiful. He had tried that in the first days. He had felt that finding anything beautiful in this context was a betrayal of something of the people who were suffering in it, of the seriousness of it, of some moral accounting that required ugliness to be only ugly and beauty to be reserved for context that deserved it. He had been wrong about this. He understood now that beauty did not require permission, did not wait for appropriate context, did not consult the moral accounts before appearing. It simply appeared, the way the light appeared, and you could refuse to receive it, but the refusing cost you something, and the cost was not worth paying because the refusal changed nothing about the beauty and everything about the person refusing. So he looked at the sky. He let it be what it was. They returned to the dugout on Artilleriskaya as the last light left the upper air and the ember glow of the burning districts took its place. The dugout was warmer than the streets. the earth holding the heat of the day in a way the open air did not, and it smelled of the tea that had been made that morning and of the particular enclosed smell of many people inhabiting a small space over several days, which was not a pleasant smell but had become a familiar one, which was its own kind of comfort. Baranov and Grishko were already there. Baranov was sitting with a piece of paper on his knee, writing. He wrote with the careful deliberateness of someone for whom writing was not effortless, each letter formed with attention, the pen moving slowly, the line of text appearing word by word rather than in the flowing continuous motion of habitual writers. He was writing a letter. Alexei understood this without needing to be told. He understood also that he would not ask about the letter, because some things are private in a way that has nothing to do with secrecy and everything to do with the particular sanctity of the things we say to the people who are the reason we are trying to stay alive. Grishko was doing something with a length of wire, bending it, shaping it, his hands working with the automatic dexterity of someone who is thinking about something else while his hands manage themselves. He looked up when they came in and then looked back down at the wire. He had the expression of someone who has moved through something difficult and come out on the other side changed and is taking the quiet measure of the change. The young soldier with a wide, honest face, Alexei, had learned his name that afternoon. Volkov, Andrei Volkov, 18 years old, from a village outside Penza, was asleep in his corner, his face in sleep so completely young that it stopped the breath for a moment, the face that had not yet finished deciding what it would look like fully released in sleep into its essential unfinished youth. Ostrovsky was at the communications end of the dugout, listening to something on the field telephone with the steady, concentrated expression of a man receiving information he is simultaneously translating into its operational meaning. He did not look up. Alexei found his section of wall and sat down. He sat for a while without speaking, without being spoken to, in the particular companionable silence that had developed among the five of them: himself, Laziv, Baranov, Grishko, and in some ongoing way Galina, who was not here and was never not here over the days of moving and resting and crossing and watching. It was the silence of people who have been through enough together that silence no longer requires filling, that its presence is not a gap or failure of conversation, but simply the form that understanding sometimes takes when it has gone beyond the need for words. The food that evening was better than it had been. Not good food was not good. Food was sustenance. Food was the fuel the body required to continue the continuing, but better, in that there was more of it and it was warmer. A stew of some kind, with actual meat in it. The origin of the meat unasked and unanswered in the way that certain questions are unasked in certain contexts because the answer is less important than the fact. Black bread, a small amount of something sweet, a preserve of some kind, dark red, passed around on the handle of the spoon so that each person could take a small amount, and each person took exactly the right amount, which was the amount that left enough for the next person. They ate, and then, in the way that evenings in the dugout had developed their own rhythm over the days, they talked. Not about the war, or not directly about the war, not about the operational specifics of it, not about the factory or the crossing or the things that had happened in the dark of the previous night. They had learned all of them, without having discussed it, that the evenings were not for that. The evenings were for the other things. The things that the war was being fought in the service of, or the things that the war was being fought to return to, which was perhaps the same thing. Baranov finished his letter and folded it and put it inside his coat, against his chest. He looked up. He looked at the group with the expression of a man returning from somewhere private to somewhere shared, adjusting his eyes to the new light. "Tell me something," he said, not to anyone in particular, to the room. "Tell me something about home, something specific, something small." A pause. Then Grishko, without looking up from the wire in his hands, "My mother makes a pie, with apples, from the tree in the yard. She makes it every autumn when the apples are ready, and the whole house smells of it for 2 days. The smell gets into everything. Your clothes, your hair." He paused. "Last autumn I wasn't there. I kept thinking about it, somewhere near Voronezh. I kept thinking the apples will be ready now. She'll be making the pie." He turned the wire in his hands. I could almost smell it. The dugout held this for a moment. "My daughters sing," Baranov said. "They sing together, Masha and Vera, in the evenings. They make up their own words to songs they know, silly words, and they sing them very seriously as though the silly words are the real words, and they look at each other while they sing, and they start to laugh, and then they are laughing and singing simultaneously." He paused. "The sound of it. I don't have a word for the sound of it," Lazaeva said. "There's a street in Leninsk near the school where there's a linden tree. An enormous one. Much older than anything around it. Much older than the buildings. In June it flowers and the whole street smells of it. You can smell it from 2 blocks away." She paused. "I walked under it every morning on the way to school. I stopped noticing it after a while. The way you stop noticing the things that are always there." Another pause. "I will not stop noticing it again." They looked at Alexei. He thought. He thought about the yellow light through the east window. He thought about the cast iron pot and the sound of the fire inside it, the low river rushing sound of it. He thought about the wheat in July and Doria's laugh and his father at the Don River, standing at the water's edge with the boy beside him. "My father," he said, "used to walk the field boundaries in the evening. Every evening, before dark. Not to check anything in particular or maybe to check everything. The whole field, the whole of what he'd worked on, just to see it at the end of the day before the dark took it." He paused. "I used to go with him sometimes. We didn't talk much. We just walked the boundaries and looked at the wheat and turned around and came home." He stopped. "I would give a great deal to walk those boundaries again. Just that. Just the walking." No one spoke for a moment. Then Volkov, young Volkov, who had apparently woken from his sleep and was lying on his side listening, said, in a voice still thick with sleep, "My grandmother keeps bees." They all looked at him. He didn't seem embarrassed. He said it the way you say a thing that is simply true, and its truth is the whole of the reason for saying it. "She has 12 hives," he said, "on the south side of the garden, in a row. She talks to them. She says you have to tell the bees what's happening in the family or they leave." He paused. "I wonder if she's told them about me." The silence that followed, this was the warmest silence of the evening. Alexei thought about 12 hives on the south side of a garden. He thought about a woman talking to bees, keeping them informed of the family's affairs. He thought about the bees receiving this information and deciding, on the basis of it, to stay. He thought it was possibly the most reasonable thing he had heard in weeks. "She'll have told them," Baranov said, with certainty. Volkov looked at him. "Grandmothers always tell them," Baranov said. "It's the first thing." Something moved across Volkov's young face. Relief, perhaps, or the thing that relief produces when it arrives unexpectedly, a brief brightness, quickly folded back into the ordinary expression but leaving a trace of itself behind, the way light leaves an afterimage. Yes, Volkov said. Probably. He put his head back down and closed his eyes. The evening deepened. The sounds of the city continued their nighttime grammar above and around them. But in the dugout the sounds were muffled, softened by the earth on every side, arriving as suggestions rather than facts. The percussion from the west. The settling of something large, somewhere north. The wind, which had picked up again off the steppe, moving through the open buildings above and making the low sound that open buildings make when the wind finds them, the sound of air moving through spaces designed for other things, a kind of accidental music. Alexei leaned his head back against the brick. He was not trying to sleep. He was simply resting in the evening, in the warmth of the dugout, in the company of these people who had become, over the days of moving and resting and crossing and watching, the people he knew most completely in the world. Not most deeply he had known Doria and his mother and his father with a depth of years that could not be compressed into days. But most completely, in the sense that he knew these people without the filters that ordinary social life places between people. He had seen them frightened and tired and purposeful and gentle and capable of things they had not known they were capable of. He had sat with them in the dark and heard them speak about their mothers and their daughters and their linden trees and their apple pies and their grandmother's bees. He knew them in the way that people know each other when the ordinary distances have been removed and what remains is simply the person, without architecture. It was a strange gift of this strange situation. He closed his eyes. He thought about what came next. Not tomorrow was a fact that would present itself when it arrived, with its own specific demands, its own crossings and calculations, its own weight. But after tomorrow, the accumulation of tomorrows that would eventually he had to believe this. It was not a belief he could afford to let go of resolve into the thing that was on the other side of this. He thought about going home. Not the act of going home, not the logistics of it, not the route or the transport or the bureaucracy of demobilization. He thought about the moment of arrival, the specific moment when Miranovka would come into view, the low houses, the church, the fields beyond, and somewhere among the fields, the boundaries his father had walked. He thought about the crooked chimney. He thought about his mother's kitchen and the east window and the color of the morning light that had no name and was only itself. He thought about Doria, who might or might not be waiting, who had her own life that had been continuing through all of this, that was not paused like a held breath but ongoing, accumulating its own days and changes and tomorrows in the way that all lives do regardless of the events happening to other people. He did not know what he would find. He knew only that he wanted to find it, wanted to go looking, wanted the chance to see what had become of the things he had left. The chance was the thing, the possibility. As long as the river was behind him, the chance was still there. He breathed in. He breathed out. Around him, the dugout was settling into sleep. He could hear it happening, the breathing changing, lengthening, the small adjustments of bodies finding their positions for the night, the sighs that are not sadness but release, the body giving its weight to the earth and the earth accepting it. Baranov, breathing his slow, deep sleep. Grishko, the wires set aside now, his open-mouthed concentration replaced by the open-mouthed sleep of the exhausted young. Volkov, already deeply under, already wherever sleep had taken him, perhaps his grandmother's garden, the 12 hives in a row on the south side, the woman talking softly to them in the evening, telling them the news. Lazaeva was still awake. He could tell by the quality of her stillness, which was different from sleep's stillness, more deliberate, more present. Lazareva, he said, very quietly. Yes, she said. The linden tree, he said. In June. A pause. Yes, she said. You'll walk under it again. Another pause. Longer. Yes, she said. I know. He said nothing more. She said nothing more. The thing had been said, and that was sufficient, and the saying of it had done what it needed to do, which was simply to exist, to be placed into the air of the dugout and left there, a fact about the future that neither of them could guarantee, but both of them were choosing to believe, because the choosing was available to them and the not choosing served nothing. He closed his eyes. The city continued its work outside. It would continue through the night and into the morning and beyond the morning, the long, terrible work of it, and he would continue inside it, tomorrow and the day after, moving and watching and crossing and calculating, collecting the some things and building them into structures to stand in. He knew this. He accepted it. But that was tomorrow. Tonight there was the dugout and the warmth of it, and the breathing of the people around him, and the muffled sounds of the city arriving as suggestions, and somewhere beyond the eastern wall of the dugout, beyond the streets and the embankment and the broken stone, the river, moving in the dark, moving south, carrying whatever light the burning city laid on its surface and carrying it southward, and never stopping, and never stopping, and never. He slept, and in the sleeping there were wheat fields, gold in the morning light, and a path curving ahead, and somewhere along the curving path a sound that was worth walking toward. And the walking was easy, and the wheat on either side moved in a wind that smelled of nothing but itself, and the sky was the sky's own blue, and the path went on, and on, and on, and the river, somewhere beyond the fields, moved south, and did not stop. This concludes the story for tonight. Sleep well. Good night.